My name is Chip Pickering. I'm the CEO of INCOMPAS, and I want to welcome everyone to our webinar. During the last few months of the pandemic, we have been having a series of Ask the Executive from our member companies and their CEOs and top leadership ranks is how they are managing through this crisis. And we think it's been very informative, very helpful, and so we welcome and appreciate you joining us today. We're going to be discussing the next round of COVID legislation and what it means to the broadband industry and for the country at large, and trying to outline what we believe will be in the next version of COVID legislation that's very important to our member companies and for the broadband industry at large. Let me talk a little bit about who INCOMPAS is. We are the leading internet and competitive network association. We've been in existence almost 40 years, and we represent the leading fiber companies, wireless companies, satellite companies, and internet companies. We, as our name suggests, we encompass all the different platforms and technologies. Our core uniting vision, mission, principle is to promote competition across all of those platforms in all of those markets. The pandemic has really shown what amazing companies that we have and the response to the crisis and how they've kept America connected and running. And as we've had this dramatic shift in online education, telemedicine and telehealth, and work from home, how our networks have withstood all of the pressure and performed amazingly during this time. Our companies led the effort in keeping a pledge asked by the FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, to keep America connected. And the legislation that is now pending before the Senate has passed the House will be trying to find ways to shift funds to meet the needs of the present and in this present crisis. How do we help our companies that are providing E-rate or educational connectivity during this time to students at home, to the schools that are trying to instruct online? How do we help as our hospitals and healthcare providers are trying to conduct telemedicine and telehealth, not in the hospital and in the office, but remotely? And then how do we keep our businesses up and running? And as they come out of the crisis, how do we accelerate and speed the recovery? And we have a great team of advocates at INCOMPAS, and so we're going to be talking about our efforts to work with key members on a bipartisan basis, House and Senate, and the key committees on the next round of legislation. Angie Kronenberg, who is our general counsel and chief advocate, is going to kick things off. We'll have questions at the end, and we really look forward to the discussion to talk through what is pending and what we hope will pass this summer that will address many of the priorities and critical needs of our member companies in the country at large. So thank you for joining us today. We want to welcome, if you're not a member, we hope that you will join our calls as we promote competition in broadband networks everywhere. So thank you for joining us today. And Angie, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you, Chip. As a result of the pandemic, the need for connectivity is more important than ever. As employees are working from home, school children are learning from home, and healthcare is being delivered at home. We all know, depending upon which statistics you look at, the FCC estimates about 20 million Americans don't have access at home. Other statistics show that up to 45 million Americans don't have access at home. So bringing connectivity to Americans, ensuring those who have found themselves in financial difficulty can still stay connected is also really important. The other thing that has really been highlighted throughout this is that small businesses also have been impacted as a result of the pandemic. Many have had to shutter their storefronts. Some are beginning to reopen depending upon which state you're in and whether or not you're in phase 1 or phase 2. But there's also potential resurgence of the need to shutter businesses. So having the connectivity so that consumers can do their business from home, as well as for small businesses who can operate from home, really be able to continue to do that. So all of these issues have really been discussed and continue to be discussed on the Hill among industry, consumer, and public interest organizations. And INCOMPAS has been in the midst of all of those conversations, which is really why we wanted to host this webinar, so that you could hear a little bit more about the work that we've been doing and what we've been stressing in our conversations with Congress and with other public interest and consumer groups. So it's really important to note that there have been a number of bills that have been introduced both in the House and the Senate that would address different needs. In the House in particular, the Democrats passed what's called the HEROES Act, which includes broadband connectivity as part of its requirements. So there, they're looking at the immediate connectivity needs for consumers who've been impacted, low-income consumers, consumers who have lost their jobs. How do we ensure that they continue to have access to broadband? It also would address school children and teacher needs in the homes. So how do we ensure that they have devices as well as the service that they need while schools are being conducted at home? And while the school year has pretty much finished out for most school children at this moment in time, schools are wrestling with what they're going to do in the fall. My own child's school is wrestling with this for the fall. I have one that's in high school. I have one that's starting college. And we're hearing from both of the schools, that they are trying to figure out what to do. And at least one element very well could be that children will continue to school from home. So making sure all school children have the access that they need to go to class, get their schoolwork online is going to be incredibly important. And the HEROES Act addresses that. In addition, the HEROES Act has a mandate for service. This is something that's very concerning for our members. Our members are really very supportive of addressing the immediate connectivity needs for many consumers and for school children, and making sure that devices, are also sponsored and paid for. But there are real concerns about revenue decline that's happening in the industry, and being able to continue to pay for the network operations. All the networks are interconnected to each other. We pay for access to be able to interconnect with other networks and vice versa. So as there has been revenue decline because businesses have been shuttered and not been able to pay their bills, and if this continues for months on end, there are real concerns about the impact on the networks themselves, our ability to continue to stay operating. So we have a number of member companies who have been volunteering to keep service up and running through the Keep Americans Connected pledge that Chairman Pai at the FCC led on. That it's key that Congress be thinking about not just how to pay for people to come on that have never been online or that are at risk of not being online because of their own situation, but that they also look at the small business protections and the small broadband provider protections to make sure that if these businesses begin to falter who are providing this connectivity and providing competitive connectivity, that there's a means to ensure that they will have a place to go to get a little extra funding so that they can keep their businesses operating as well. So that's a really important aspect of what Congress is looking at in terms of potential payments. And then the final bucket is healthcare. What can be done to shore up the healthcare systems? We still have a number of entities that need more connectivity, that need to be able to reach their patients in their homes. So again, it's going to be really important that as Congress looks at potential funding needs, that they also focus to make sure healthcare facilities and doctors' offices also can be connected to consumers. So those are the buckets of things. As I mentioned, the House has passed the HEROES Act. So really the next, where the action is likely to be happening then is in the Senate. So we're going to want to spend a little bit of time focusing on what we think may be in Senate legislation for the next round of COVID and then the timing of that. So I'm going to finish there and pass it over to Chip, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Senate process. Thanks, Chip.
Angie, thank you very much. And based on our conversations with key members of the Senate on both sides of the aisle and key committee staff, we think that the outline of what will be included on the Senate side, and there is an emerging consensus that broadband will be included on the Senate effort on the next COVID round of legislation. And these are some of the elements, and there may be more, but let me just kind of go through a list of things that we believe that will be included. One, funding for the companies that have installed equipment from Huawei that needs to be, because of a government mandate, to rip and replace that equipment for national security reasons, that there will be funding included for that initiative. And we think somewhere around $2 billion for that effort. Senator Warner from Virginia has legislation promoting new technologies, ORAN, that stands for Open Architecture Radio Area Network, and the research that a number of our companies like Dish and others are looking as a way to lead the international competition in 5G. We believe that that will also be included. Something that we've really been advocating from INCOMPAS and with other associations is for those companies that have kept America connected and kept the pledge that the FCC chairman asked for member companies and other industry broadband providers around the country to do to keep America up and running and connected during this time, is a reimbursement fund to cover their revenues that are lost and the costs associated with keeping that pledge. And we do believe that there's an emerging consensus to include different elements to have a fund to cover the carriers and providers of all sizes, both in the consumer market, residential market, as well as in the business market. So that's something that we think is very, very critical, as Angie talked about. We believe that there will be provisions to expand E-rate and to be more flexible in what can be covered under the E-rate program in a one-time fund for devices, for MiFi, for Wi-Fi, for other things as we've shifted to at-home learning. All the things that you will need during this pandemic crisis this year, maybe going into the fall and into the spring. And so we think that there will be a one-time expansion of E-rate funding. And again, could be anywhere from $2 billion or more. For the consumers that struggle to be connected, especially those who are recipients of something called Lifeline, we believe additional funding will be part of the Lifeline program. INCOMPAS has really been the lead association advocating for removing the barriers to build new networks, deploy new broadband networks, both wired and wireless, the small cell, fiber, and the things that are critical for our country to really be connected both in rural markets and rural America and in urban areas and markets. And so the deployment legislation that Senator Wicker, Senator Thune, and others have proposed, we're cautiously optimistic that that will be included in the Senate version. And we're continuing to push and advocate for that to be included, that not only do you need the funding for all these critical services, but you need to remove the barriers that will allow our companies to build and deploy as quickly as possible. There is a new consensus, both Republican, Democrat, and I think there's a new national awareness that broadband for everyone, everywhere, for all Americans is now a national consensus, a national priority, and a national objective that will come out of this pandemic and the COVID crisis. And so all of these various provisions of the legislation in the Senate, we hope and think that the broadband elements should represent about $10 to $15 billion in overall funding. I think that number is still fluid and undecided. by the Senate leadership and key members of the Senate. We will continue to work to get as much funding for the priorities as possible. The flexibility to help fund online education, telemedicine, and telehealth. And we do think that there will be additional funding for rural telemedicine and other forms of telehealth and telemedicine, also on the list of things from the Senate bill. So with that, Angie, anything that I left out that I forgot to mention, I would welcome anything else that you might want to add.
Chip, what about the process? What's the likely timing for the Senate to take up the next round of COVID legislation that likely will include these broadband provisions?
What we're hearing is that it's likely sometime in July, whether that is the first part of July or the end of July. We hope that it's sooner, and we'll be pushing for action just because we don't want to get too close to the elections. The national conventions, the political conventions begin in August. Once you get to that point, and the Congress recesses, and then the political and campaign season starts in September, October. So if we could move by July on the next round of COVID legislation, the differences between the House and the Senate are going to be fairly significant. And they'll need to be able to resolve those differences either in conference or in leadership and White House negotiations. We do believe that a lot of work has already been done, that the framework and the foundation and the legislative language on most of these elements that we've discussed today are already pretty well thought through. The staff has been great on the Senate Commerce Committee on both sides of the aisle. We've been working closely with Senator Wicker, who's the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee from my home state of Mississippi, Senator Markey from Massachusetts, who's been a longtime ally and advocate for competition, as we try to build a bipartisan consensus in the Senate so that we can go to the House, hopefully with the basis for an agreement to get something done before we get beyond July of this year.
So we've been talking a lot about the immediate needs of the nation, dealing with their connectivity and shoring up broadband providers who are smaller, the competitive providers who oftentimes are the ones that are willing to go out to areas that even the incumbents, don't reach. And those are really critical. There is an aspect that's being discussed in the House right now too, led by House Majority Whip Clyburn, to have a significant infrastructure funding for broadband networks. That, along with ensuring that there's money going to helping people understand how to use broadband, so the educational piece of broadband use and how it can really change your life. What are the chances we see a significant infrastructure bill like the Clyburn bill pass the Senate, Chip?
I think beyond the outline of what I discussed that is in the new Senate bill, it becomes more problematic and more difficult the higher the funding outlay in this year, a political year, that we'll have a consensus on something that is that expansive and is that major in scope. Having said that, you are seeing this emerging bipartisan consensus that broadband is the indispensable infrastructure, the critical infrastructure of our economy, school, and healthcare systems now. And for the recovery to go as fast as possible, those types of areas of consensus, it might break, you never know. In a political environment like this, something can break loose and happen. And so we want to be prepared just in case the Clyburn bill combined with the Senate initiatives and whether or not a consensus could be formed before the end of July. It is possible. I don't know if it's probable at this time, but we do need to be prepared. In some form of that, maybe a down payment of what is needed and with the FCC moving on a number of different fronts. Angie, you may want to just talk about things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund,
Sure.
of agriculture. We really won't get into that, but it has a major broadband funding initiative to rural America. You have telemedicine and telehealth initiatives that have already been funded. We have the E-rate hopes that we think will be in the Senate provisions to give us more funding and flexibility for the E-rate program. What are some of the things both from the House and the FCC that our members need to know about?
Right. Well, as you know, Chip, the FCC for a long time has been focused on how to bridge that digital divide and bring more broadband network capability to consumers. From 10 years ago when they set out the National Broadband Plan and the first implementation of how to reform the high-cost universal service program to support broadband, they went to what they call the Connect America Fund and did an auction in phase 2 for those areas where the large incumbent telcos chose not to deliver broadband. So a number of our member companies bid in the CAF phase 2, and they're now beginning to deliver service based upon that funding. But the commission under the current leadership moved into the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that you just referenced, Chip, and that is on schedule to begin in the fall at the FCC. And that is, it has a $16 billion price tag right now. And members will have an opportunity, to go to those areas that may continue to lack funding and bid and reverse auction. So that is a really great opportunity for our member companies. And we know that a number of folks are looking at that, what they can do to bring broadband, that's high level of speed of broadband to consumers and to businesses in their area.
I know that as we have a number of companies and participants on the webinar that may have questions from either one of us, and if this is, Angie, a good time to begin opening up to questions, or if there's anything else that you think is really important that we need to talk about or stress before we go to questions.
I don't have anything else before we hit the questions. I think there may be a few that are already pending.
I think Andrew is going to be our...
Yeah, I'll try to moderate as many questions as possible.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew.
To our viewers to keep submitting, and I'll try to get them out to Chip and Angie. One question we have from an audience member is, what are related updates to the FCC and the Universal Service Administrative Company's revisions to E-rate, if there are any?
Angie, I don't know if you want to take that.
Yeah, Andrew, can you repeat that question? I wasn't sure I caught the tail end of it.
Yeah, he's asking if there's any related updates to the FCC and Universal Service Administrative Company's revisions to E-rate.
Yeah, my understanding is that there were some revisions that the commission was going to make to the form for E-rate that they now have delayed to give folks just an opportunity to focus on their businesses as it is and the E-rate program as it is. Now, obviously, with this potential legislation pending that could pass that would provide additional funding to connect students at home as well as to pay for their devices, that would add another layer of administrative requirements. In our conversations with folks, I mean, they want to do everything they can to make the administrative requirements as easy as possible because they want the program to roll out immediately, really fast. So I would anticipate that we would see our agent, the FCC, the agency, and the USAC really focused on how do we make things as easy as possible during the COVID.
And just to add to what Angie is saying, based on our conversations, the Senate is asking the FCC, what is the easiest, fastest way, and from an administrative point of view, what is the best way to get the funds to telemedicine, telehealth, and to broadband deployment through both RDOF and through any type of connectivity reimbursement fund. And we think that the USAC model is existing, and they'll be looking at ways to use that to get funding to the key carriers and providers across all parts of the country and all parts of the market as quickly as possible.
All right, great. So another question we have is, how do you see 5G's impact on broadband, the initiatives? Do you see any significant, upcoming, Chip, you may mention something in the Senate, but if there's anything else you can allude to on any capabilities with 5G happening with legislation?
So Senator Thune and Senator Schatz have worked very closely to come up with a bill that would expedite and remove barriers and streamline deployment for small cells, a critical component of the 5G architecture and 5G networks to come, where you have a number of principles. One, shot clocks that when a permit is filed in a locality, that there's a reasonable period of time for that permit to be acted upon. The reasonableness of fees, so to make sure that there's not a unreasonable rate or fee that is being charged as broadband companies in our markets and build out the new networks. So that reasonableness of fees, and what we've been advocating and working with the Senate Commerce Committee is to extend those same principles for the small cell deployments to the fiber deployment. We think fiber is the foundation of 5G. Small cells are a critical element of the 5G architecture, and in combination, if we're going to be able to win the race to 5G against China and really connect all Americans to the next generation of advanced networks and services and the economy that will ride on top of that in the future, that removing those barriers, streamlining the deployments, and giving a certainty for the investment that is needed to build the new networks is a critical component of policymaking. The FCC has made a number of changes over the last 2 years where we've been the lead advocate. Things like One Touch Make Ready, another small cell order from the FCC. So we're very optimistic and hopeful that the Senate will include those types of provisions in the next round of COVID legislation. We need to work to build greater consensus with Democrats in the House and the Senate, and to do something that would be helpful to the localities that are trying to have the resources and to gain the expertise and the knowledge of how to work with our member companies. We want to make it as collaborative as possible so that we can speed and streamline the deployment across the country.
Great.
We see our member companies, are oftentimes accessing new geographic territory, which means that they need to deal with the governments in those territories in order to gain access to the public rights of way, do the pole attachments, whether it's the fiber or the wireless build. Companies that are already present in that geographic territory already have those rights. So it's really key that we lower as much of the barriers as possible so that it's faster, it will be cheaper in the long run, and it'll bring more competitive opportunity to areas, which is helpful not just in the retail market, but it's also helpful in the wholesale market so that, carriers are already present, have another option in order for connectivity.
Okay, another question I have for either of you. Is there any delineation between types of services, particularly wireline versus wireless, and any of the infrastructure funding legislative programs being considered?
So we do see that the Congress is focused on speeds as well as ensuring that consumers, are obtaining the capacity that's needed in order for the service to work effectively. Generally, policymakers like to have a technology neutral approach, but at the same time, we are seeing some of the legislation be a little bit more specific about the types of speed and that's going to be required in order to obtain the funding. So it depends on the legislation, but we do see that at times, yes.
Great.
The
The question is,
and then let me just add, the great thing about INCOMPAS is we have member companies that really represent every technology, every form of network and platform, from wireless to satellite to fiber to SD-WAN, our business providers, and what they do to offer services. So we want to keep it technology neutral, but we do advocate for the highest speed possible and to weight any of the USF and the RDOF funding and broadband funding to really take our nation's standards up on broadband speed and capacity.
Yeah, it would be nice to see, when we're going to make significant investments, especially in infrastructure, that it is infrastructure that's going to serve our nation for a long time. So that is, we think a really important, especially if Congress is going to put billions of dollars into infrastructure, that they're thinking about it not as like a one-lane highway system, but they're thinking about it as a system that can really grow and meet all of the capacity needs of the nation. And we do see the economy is becoming a much more digitized and relying upon online services, which is, on the one hand has been really good for the economy in terms of pandemic, because there are so many people who can work from home and continue to conduct business. But in order for us to have this kind of activity online everywhere in the United States, we need a robust broadband network.
okay, very good. Another question we have is do you think it's likely that COVID-19 credit reimbursements will extend beyond residential and SMB customers to include reimbursement credits for larger customers such as hospitals?
Angie, you can add to this as well, but I'm cautiously optimistic that based on our conversations, that it will include both business and residential reimbursements to the companies that provide services to both markets. The small and mid-sized businesses, all the retailers, hospitals have really taken a significant loss of revenue and business. And that's on the business side of the market. That's where we've seen the greatest shift of network usage to the residential and to the in-home, to stay at home, to work, to learn, to have your telehealth or telemedicine, which is putting enormous strains on our companies who serve the business market. And for both the speed of recovery economically, we need to make sure that our companies who serve the business market are reimbursed and have the funds to keep everyone connected, because those companies are coming back, they're starting back. And for them to face the possibility of having broadband services that they can't pay for, and our companies not being able to be able to continue their services, it's just a critical component, I believe, of the economic recovery. So we're cautiously optimistic based on our conversations, both with key members of the Senate and the FCC, that we'll see reimbursements on all parts of the market, both residential and business.
Angie, anything or? Okay.
No.
Okay. Another question we have is regarding the HEROES Act, and a question on how for directing the FCC to accept long form applications for RDOF by July 31st, and specifically removing any areas from RDOF auction where there's an applicant proposing to provide gigabyte service and awarding RDOF funding to the gigabyte applicant by the end of September. So with what you discussed earlier, Chip, do you think this effort to accelerate RDOF awards to gigabyte firms is likely to become law?
Yeah, my sense is that the Senate is going to take a different position than the House. They want to maintain the consensus and their approach that has developed at the FCC for the October schedule. So I don't see an acceleration, but to think through how much work has gone into what the reverse auctions for those eligible companies that are bidding. We do believe that the FCC will wait to 1 gig services and the higher broadband speeds, that whoever offers to serve those rural and unserved markets at those higher speeds will have a better chance of winning the funding that will be coming in that round of RDOF. As Angie mentioned, it's $16 billion. That's a significant investment. We do believe that everything is on track and on schedule for October, and the current path that the FCC is on is likely to be sustained. Angie, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you covered it, Chip. I think that's exactly right.
Perfect. All right. Another question we have is, can you discuss how you think the U.S. Geological Survey's 3D elevation program, 3D data can be leveraged by FCC, NTIA, RUS for specific terrain mapping to help with the original base level map for the FCC to utilize, as well as to help siting and permitting decisions for rural broadband infrastructure deployment?
I don't know a lot of information about that, but what I do know about mapping is that it's currently really inadequate. And the part of what the FCC is looking for through the broadband legislation is the funding that they need to implement the last Broadband Mapping Act that Congress passed last year, which INCOMPAS is incredibly supportive of, and thinks that it's important that the commission get mapping correct for a variety of reasons, not just for funding for deployment, but also for competition analysis. And we have a proceeding pending at the FCC right now where they are talking about using information from the Form 477, which everyone knows isn't as accurate as it needs to be making policy choices on for deployment, much less for competition analysis. So, all of the efforts to improve upon mapping is incredibly important, and INCOMPAS is supportive of that.
And Angie, just to add to that, I do believe that funding for mapping will be in the Senate bill.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's one of Senator Wicker's highest priorities. There's a consensus, House and Senate, FCC, everyone supports the funding to do the mapping that's required, both for the deployment and from our perspective, we hope, for the competition policy ahead. So that is one thing that I left out on my list that I should have added, and that is funding for the mapping initiative.
Great.
And I mean, compared to some of the other funds, it's a fairly modest amount.
All right. One other question we have is, do you expect Keep American Connections reimbursement to have a customer cap? And do you expect the pledge to also be codified? And what size do you expect for the pool of funds, if any?
So let me take a real quick on. My sense is that the Senate is going to try to not have a customer cap. They'll have some type of formula so that it is as neutral but between competitors and incumbents and between the different types of networks, and both on the consumer and the residential market. They will have to try to develop criteria and a formula for the disbursement of the funding. Did you keep, for example, did you keep the pledge to keep America connected? Did you do other things that would give you a higher weight as it relates to your E-rate and what you did to serve your community and customers during the COVID crisis? What are you doing in telemedicine and telehealth? So I think that there'll be some weighted criteria for the companies that will be asking for reimbursement, but I'm not sure if there'll be a cap. Two, Andrew, if you'd repeat the question, elements of the question.
Yeah, sure. If you expect the pledge to also be codified, and
I don't expect the pledge to be codified. I think that the Senate will take a strong position against codifying the pledge, and we would, as INCOMPAS, would advocate very strongly. We think that one, it's unconstitutional, it would be a taking of a requirement unless there's some funding that would fully compensate uh, the ability of our companies and other companies to keep that type of pledge. But I'm hopeful that the commitment will not be codified. We've had a tremendous voluntary response. I think as INCOMPAS, we were very, very proud that almost all of our member companies took the pledge voluntarily, and they kept businesses and hospitals and critical institutions up and running. And we don't think a codification would be necessary.
Yeah, our member companies have been working really hard to be as flexible as they can be to keep their customers. And we're competitors in the market. You know, when a customer leaves, they're going to just go to somebody else. So it has really been very important to our member companies that they keep all of their customers, keep them connected, because you know, this is their community. This is, you know, where they live and where they work. And that is just a critical part of ensuring that their local economy can stay up and operating. And that as we move into the various phases of the pandemic and operations for the businesses, that they have the ability to just get back to their business and not have to be focused on getting reconnected, you know, their communication services. So it's a key part of the recovery effort, making sure that the communications stay on and is ready to go when businesses open their doors again.
And Andrew, I think that you asked, what do we think that the size of the fund might be?
Yeah.
There's earlier legislation introduced by Senator Klobuchar and Senator Kramer, bipartisan basis, that addressed many of the smaller carriers in the market and those that are serving rural markets. And that fund was approximately $2 billion. And we think that as you expand that and grow it to cover more of a national and neutral basis of all carriers everywhere, serving all markets, that it's going to have to be significantly higher. What that number is, again, we think that the Senate will be somewhere in the 10 to 15 billion total that would be covering telemedicine, E-rate, Lifeline, and some of the other priorities that we've discussed today. So we would hope that the fund would be at least 5 billion. We'll be advocating for the highest level possible, because our member companies and all the companies that are providing broadband connectivity, no matter its size, really has stepped up to the plate and has kept America running and operating, and really the country would be in a much more difficult place without what our companies, the broadband industry and competitive industry, has done to step up during this very challenging time.
All right, well, I have one a little easier question for both of you. Any predictions on what you think Congress will do? And I mean, you had mentioned in the upcoming months, Chip, but in the foreseeable future with the election and the possibility of a new administration, what impact that might have on any of the legislation currently and Congress moving forward?
Yeah, right now, the Congress is responding to the different crises that have resulted as it relates to the police actions and a number of the police reforms that are now being proposed and debated. And so we think that over the next few weeks, Congress will focus on that. And in July, we'll shift to the next round of COVID legislation. There's an outside possibility of bringing in more infrastructure initiatives to help on the economic recovery. The last item I mentioned has the least likely option of passing. But I do think police reform, COVID legislation are probably the two things Congress will get done before the August recess. And then once we go into campaign season, it's hard for me to see much of anything happening other than nominations and issues that may be important, but of smaller policy implications where there is just broad consensus on both sides of the aisle. Angie, I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add to that.
No, not for this year. Wasn't clear if they were asking about just this year, if they predictions for next year too.
Yeah, Angie, would you like to take approach on the FCC and how the upcoming election might have an impact on anything moving forward there?
Well, first, just this year, the FCC, we see a very active agency that the chairman, the pandemic has not slowed him down. And he obviously has an agenda that he'd like to ensure gets completed this year before the election. So we are working on a number of proceedings with our members at the FCC right now. We have the ongoing uni resale proceeding, as well as the telephone access charges proceeding. As I mentioned, a number of our member companies are looking at the RDOF, and I think we'll be participating in the RDOF. So that is very active as well. There are still other things that are going on that maybe we're not as focused on, but it's clear that this FCC has much to finish. And knowing Chairman Pai, as long as I've known him and his staff, I have every confidence that they will get the things done that they really want to get done. So it is important to keep that in mind. I think it's really hard to predict next year yet. I think we could see a very wild ride for a presidential election over the next couple of months. And there were a lot of folks who were willing to make predictions 4 years ago that did not turn out true. So, I hate to go out on a limb. I think you could see, if we see a change in administrations in the White House, as well as Senate control, I think you could see a very active Democratic Party wanting to make sure that there's a lot of investment happening in the US. So things like the Clyburn bill right now and that huge infrastructure investment in broadband, that very well could happen and would be a very exciting opportunity for our industry, both from the perspective of the opportunity to build, as well as the perspective of our companies that we represent who offer online services. So from social platforms to websites. So I think it could be a very exciting opportunity for them, if that were to happen. There could be other challenges, that the online companies face, no matter who's in control. So those are also issues that we work on at INCOMPAS. I know that's not our topic today, but we do, a variety of things.
Great. Thank you, Chip and Angie. And that's pretty much the last of our questions. So Chip, over to you for any final comments.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you're not a member of INCOMPAS, we want to invite you to join us, join the cause. We believe that a coalition of competitive companies advocating before Congress and the FCC does make a difference. And we think that if you join us, that you can help us as we fight for greater competition, more investment in our broadband networks, the removal of barriers so that we can deploy the next generation, win the race to 5G, most importantly, serve America, connect America, and make what we believe is a significant progress on the key priorities of our member companies, the communities they serve, the critical institutions they serve. So thank you again for joining us. Angie, I want to thank your whole team on the great work that y'all do at the FCC and on the Hill. And again, we want to continue answering any of your questions. Feel free to call us at any time. I think Julia Stroud will have her contact information on the screen so that if you do want to get in touch with us, if you do have any questions, either on policy or on membership, we will follow up with you. So thank you and stay safe, stay strong.